On Tuesday, the world lost one of its great literary giants and one of my favorite writers when the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Cormac McCarthy died at the age of 89. And in my humble rabbinic opinion, Cormac McCarthy was the only contemporary American writer who can even be mentioned in the same breath as Herman Melville or Mark Twain or William Faulkner. In fact, the great literary critic Harold Bloom once wrote that Cormac McCarthy's most famous book, Blood Meridian, was the single greatest novel since Faulkner wrote As I Lay Dying. But if you've read any of Cormac McCarthy's books or seen any of the movies based on his books, like No Country for Old Men, then you know that he was not an uplifting writer. His books are incredibly dark, they are very violent, and they deal with themes of nihilism and hopelessness and death. As Cormac McCarthy himself said in an interview with the New York Times Magazine in 1992, there's no such thing as life without bloodshed. In fact, I think the notion that the human species can be improved in some way, that everyone can live in harmony, is a very dangerous idea. And I thought a great deal about Cormac McCarthy this week as I was reflecting upon this morning's Torah portion, Parshat Shlach Lecha, because, in a sense, this morning's Torah portion is all about overcoming the bleak and hopeless and nihilistic worldview that defined Cormac McCarthy's literary output. As Evan spoke about in his Dvar Torah this morning's Torah portion, Parshat Shlach Lecha, recounts the Chet HaMeraglim, the infamous sin of the spies. Prior to entering the Promised Land, Moses sends 12 spies on a mission to scout out the land and bring back a report. And it's the spies' responsibility to determine whether or not the land is fallow or fertile, whether its cities are open or fortified, whether its people are weak or strong. And 10 of the spies come back and tell Moses that although the land is indeed flowing with milk and honey, they will never be able to successfully colonize it because it's simply too dangerous. They say, we can't go up to conquer the people. They are much stronger than we are. The land that we scouted is a land that devours its settlers. The people there are giants, and we are grasshoppers. As a result of this negative report, the fate of the Israelites is sealed. God punishes them by sentencing them to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, corresponding to the 40-day mission of the spies. Having failed to demonstrate faith in God, faith in themselves, and faith in the future, the Exodus generation is destined to die in the desert. And yet, not all 12 of the spies come back with such a pessimistic take. Unlike the others, Joshua and Caleb return from the mission with a positive report. They hush the people before Moses and they say, yes, it will undoubtedly be difficult, but we need to give it a shot. What other choice do we have? Let's go up and take possession of the land because no matter how insurmountable the odds, we will overcome them. And as a result of their faith in the future, their optimism, their willingness to believe, Joshua and Caleb were the only two people of the generation of the Exodus permitted to enter the Promised Land. And the moral of the story is that we're not supposed to view the world from the perspective of Cormac McCarthy or the 10 spies. Rather, we should always strive to see the world from the perspective of Joshua and Caleb, the two spies who gave both God and humanity the benefit of the doubt. And I think that unfortunately for the past 5 or 6 years, the Jewish people have been struggling mightily to embrace any kind of optimistic or positive worldview. So many of the conversations that Jews are having these days are about anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism on college campuses or the decline of the conservative movement or political instability in Israel. We are living out what the great 20th century Jewish historian Salo Baron called the lachrymose view of Jewish history. The view that Jewish history is really just a string of tragedies linked together, one after the other. A view of our collective story that focuses not on our great literary or cultural or moral or intellectual contributions to the world, but rather simply focuses on the fact that in every generation, people have tried to wipe us off the face of the earth. Maybe a better name for it, by the way, would be the Cormac McCarthy view of Jewish history. So this morning, in the spirit of the optimistic worldview of Joshua and Caleb, I want to draw your attention to 3 positive things that happened to the Jewish people this past week. Because I want you all to leave here this morning knowing that it is not all bad news for the Jews. First, last Sunday, the Lithuanian Prime Minister delivered a beautiful and moving speech about Israel at the American Jewish Committee's annual Global Forum in Tel Aviv. She called Israel a beacon for freedom and democracy in the Middle East, and she said that Israel is the world's best antidote for a nuclear Iran. And not once did she mention any tension between Israel and the European Union, which Lithuania is a member of. And this is remarkable for a number of reasons, but maybe most of all because Lithuania was particularly terrible towards the Jews of Europe during the Shoah. In fact, Lithuania is the only country in Europe which Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, officially singled out by name as being particularly enthusiastic about collaborating with Nazis in the extermination of Jews. And yet, less than 80 years after the Holocaust, the Prime Minister of Lithuania is publicly extolling the virtues of the Jewish state. That is a remarkable thing. Second, this week, Hong Kong officially built and unveiled an Eruv. For those who don't know, an Eruv is a ritual enclosure constructed for the purpose of allowing activities which are normally prohibited on Shabbat to be practiced on Shabbat, specifically the carrying of objects. On Shabbat, you're allowed to carry within the private domain, but not within the public domain. So an Eruv essentially creates a private domain within the public domain, so you are permitted to carry within that space. And really, it's just a wire that is put up to create a symbolic halachic enclosure. And you may know that Hong Kong is essentially a giant mountain. And one of the most popular things to do in Hong Kong is to climb up to what's called the peak, the top of the mountain, where there's a beautiful park and people like to have picnics and spend time in nature. But until this past week, observant Jews in Hong Kong, and there are about 5,000 Jews in Hong Kong, believe it or not, couldn't even carry a bottle of water up that mountain on Shabbat because there was no Eruv. But now, they can, and it has been a massive upgrade in the quality of Jewish life for the observant population living in Hong Kong. And by the way, that Eruv is now the easternmost Eruv in the world. Tokyo does not have one. And third, and I'm sure many of you read about this past Sunday, Israel won the bronze medal in the FIFA Under-20 World Cup after it defeated South Korea 3-1. It was a major historic victory, and it's being spoken of as the most significant Israeli athletic achievement in decades. But the win isn't just significant within Israel, it's really significant because it means that Israel can now hold its own among international soccer stars. It's further confirmation that Israel, a country which turned 75 just last month, is a real and serious player on the world stage. It really is a nation, just like any other nation on earth. And we should be very proud of the fact that the Israeli soccer team that won the bronze medal this past week wasn't only Jewish. It was made up of Jews and Muslims and Arab Christians and Bedouins. And in fact, the team's leading scorer was an 18-year-old Arab-Israeli citizen. And the team worked so beautifully together. And it's been written a great deal about as a microcosm of what potentially could be for Israeli society. And that win gave the whole country, regardless of political persuasion or religion or ethnicity, a real reason to celebrate together. So there you have it. The Lithuanian Prime Minister extolling the virtues of Israel, an Eruv in Hong Kong, an Israeli victory in the World Cup, despite what the 10 spies might have you believe, despite all the negative talk about anti-Semitism and dwindling rates of synagogue attendance, things aren't all bad for the Jewish people. And the whole point of this sermon is to remind us that we should always make an effort to elevate and celebrate all of the wonderful things that happen in the Jewish world every single week. In the spirit of Joshua and Caleb, let's strive to remember that even in the year 2023, there is still plenty of good news for the Jews. Shabbat Shalom. We turn to page 4.